some of our historians talking about World War I. So this year marks the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I, which is actually was in August. November 11th actually is the end of World War I, which didn't happen until 1918. So the 100th anniversary of the end is still a few years away. But we thought it's a good opportunity on Veterans Day here in the U.S. to think about this war that really shaped so much of the 20th century, shaped how we think about modern warfare, shaped who knows what else that I'm sure you guys are going to talk about. And we would be remiss if we didn't at least mark this occasion. So that's why we're having this with some of our most awesome faculty historians. So I'll start at the end. Josh Fulton, expert in all kinds of American history. Mary Faflice, Europe and stuff, and peacefulness. And Jim McIntyre likes to dress up in Revolutionary War clothing and talk about the revolution. So with that, I will turn that over to these guys.
Awesome.
That's
that
not
was the best intro ever. Love that intro. Well done, Troy. Who's starting?
So
Go for it. You're gonna start.
Which 5 minutes ago I said you can start this with anyone but me. So that's fine. Are you guys good? Volume?
Yeah,
cool.
keep talking to the microphone.
Will do. Okay, so what did World War I do to shape the 20th century? And I think it's a fair question even to say why talk about World War I 100 years later in the 21st century? Does it still have an effect? And I'll give some basic facts and let you judge for yourselves, and then I think we'll kind of chime in from there.
Sure.
So World War I lasts for 4 years. It is considered the first modern industrial war. You have all kinds of gadgets. Tanks are used for the first time, poison gas, air power, airplanes, the tie, right? And air forces. It all told kills about 20 million people. Most of those, as different from World War II, most of those casualties from World War I, and those numbers vary, we know, depending on whose book you read. At any rate, most of those people were actually service members. Okay, World War II is horrible because you have a lot of civilians being killed, and there's a much higher body count. Also, just people that shaped the rest of the century certainly had profound experiences in World War I. And I'll just throw out some names that pretty much at random. Many people know Adolf Hitler served in the German army in the First World War. Winston Churchill was briefly First Lord of the Admiralty until he made a huge mistake, but also served on the Western Front. Harry Truman served in World War I. George Marshall, Conrad Hilton Hotels. The founder of Ferrari Motor Company. In fact, he was in an Italian mountain unit, and the stallion Ferrari emblem, that was their. It's kind of Trivial Pursuit, but cool. Also, let's see, who else? Winnipeg Bear. So Winnie the Pooh. The inspiration for Winnie the Pooh was this Canadian soldier in this other Canadian's infantry regiment. And so after the war, when he started writing children's novels, because Winnipeg Bear was this really big, he was like a bear of a guy. He was over 6 feet tall, but huge, could pick 2 guys up, 1 in each arm, but he was so friendly, so that's Winnie the Pooh. Let's see, who else?
Ernest Hemingway.
Ernest Hemingway, certainly. J.R.R. Tolkien. Some of the images out, like J.R.R. Tolkien was on a patrol in Ypres and came across. If any of you have seen the 2 towers, they have the dead marshes, right? All these bodies sort of floating in a swamp. That was one of Tolkien's memories 20 years later when he sat down to write the book of a patrol he was on as a teenager in Ypres in World War I. Ypres is this battlefield up in Belgium, really horrible, as most battles on the Western Front ended up being. So, there's a number of people whose experiences are profoundly shaped. The war starts the beginning of the end of imperialism because all of these great European powers who have colonial empires call on troops from those empires to come fight for them. And as I was telling my 102 class just before this, if these Europeans are so racially superior to Arabs, Indians, and so forth, and North Africans, then how come you need us to fight your war? And that's a really powerful question when you take it home, you know. If you guys are so much better than us, why did you need us? And so it starts to kind of put some chinks in that racial hierarchy. And so I think that's probably about enough for me to get us started.
That's great. Just got a Lord of the Rings fact out of that I wasn't unaware of.
Absolutely.
So, okay, if I
Go
go.
ahead, yeah.
Okay. So usually when I'm talking to my students about World War I, one of the things I always say to them is that it's a very European war in the sense that it's not really a war that we as Americans own as much. We were not involved in it as much as long as Europeans were. We get into it in 1917. And so when I remember as a student in Northern Ireland studying which is part of the United Kingdom, around November, I was there in the fall of the year 2000, seeing politicians and people walking around, and just ordinary everyday people walking around with this little flower on their lapel. And it was a red poppy. And poppies grew on the fields of Belgium and France, and they're a red flower, a very sturdy, strong flower. And I remember thinking to myself, I wonder what's with these flowers? Why are they wearing them? And I realized that they're wearing them to commemorate World War I. They're wearing it to commemorate Armistice Day. And Europeans refer to it, we call it Veterans Day. They traditionally have referred to it as Armistice Day because the war was still so immediate. When you put it in the terms that, basically villages lost an entire generation of young men. And when you put it in those terms, and you'd see a group of young men, whether it's from Sussex or wherever in England, all joining up together, hey, recruiter, all you guys can go together and go forth into a battle, and then in that battle, you're seeing tens of thousands of casualties in a couple of hours. Entire generations of young men were lost. So this was seared out of the consciousness of Europeans, and they remember it in a way I think that we don't. I don't know if you guys would agree with that or not, but I think that we sort of have this, okay, we're there kind of for about a year and a half, and it's great, but for Europeans, it's so much more immediate, and it's so much still part of their collective consciousness. And I remember being struck by that almost 100 years later as a student there, seeing how much it's still very much a part of the memory of Europeans, particularly in Northern Ireland, where I noticed. If you know anything about Northern Ireland, and sorry, these guys hear me talk about all the time, but that's what I studied when I was in graduate school. And in Northern Ireland, you had a conflict going on between Catholics and Protestants for about 30 years. Well, actually, it's more like centuries, but that's another story. But they would commemorate often a lot of their different signifying events through murals. And I remember seeing murals that loyalists, people who are loyal to Britain, who want to see Northern Ireland remain part of the United Kingdom, would put up to commemorate their grandfather who served in World War I. And it was very much, they were very proud of it, and they're very proud of their service, and very proud that they were loyal to the king. And that they stayed loyal to the king when the Republic of Ireland was not so loyal to the king at that point. So I walked away out of there with a strong sense of how much more immediate and how much more real this was to them than I think it is to us here in the United States.
I think for me, the meaning of the First World War and the sort of impact of the First World War, if thinking about it as connected to the United States, I think both of you have alluded to at least some of this, the fact that we don't tend to mark it as an influential conflict in the course of our history, despite the fact that it certainly was. Growing up in the last 30 years or so, the manner in which most forms of public memory of the First World War have come through things like the Sergeant York movie from the mid-20th century, or sort of these other sort of pop images that belie the realities of a really terrible conflict. And also a conflict that I would say sort of alters how we conceive of the role of the state at home as well. This is a time in which the issues of patriotism really were questioned for some and resulted in real conflicts against individuals from all around the world because America in the early 20th century is certainly a nation that is teeming with recently arrived immigrants. And many of them had to confront questions of their own identity as a result of this. So at least for me, this is also one of the things I think that is important with the war. To the earlier point about sort of this being a European-centered war, I've always sort of been struck by how it is a conflict that really destroys a lot of the imperial structures that had existed for centuries prior. Historians like to refer to this sort of long 19th century as being this period between about 1789, so the period which the French Revolution is sort of kicking off, and then they take it all the way to 1914, so the beginning of the First World War. It does sort of beg the question then of the effect of this war when it comes to its conclusion is destroying something that had been around for quite some time.
I had a follow-on comment too. I would say it's almost many places but the U.S. A few years ago, I was at a conference in Canada on McGill University campus, which is in Montreal. And Canada and New Zealand and Australia also sent troops to Europe to fight in this because they're part of the British Empire. And two things stuck out. One, they stopped everything. So imagine at about 10:30, if all activity on this campus ceased and we all went out, even in the rain, okay, they actually brought 3 very large cannons onto campus and fired a salute, and at 11 a.m., the entire city got quiet. I mean, you could just, you hear the one bell toll and just everything stopped. So, and Montreal is the size of New York, Chicago. So imagine stopping Chicago for 10 minutes in the middle of a weekday. Mm-hmm. And so they take this very, very seriously, and everyone had poppies as well. So it's many other places around the world that remember this sacrifice, because also in Canada, a lot of kids went and never came back.
Just to pick up on that about the poppies, I just was reminded of something. I go to the BBC usually. My students hear this ad nauseum all the time from my news, and they've had a lot of articles recently, of course, for the centennial of the beginning of the war, and they had an article about the poppies. And I guess now in Britain it's become fashionable. I thought this is such a great reflection of modern society, that not only in addition to the red poppies. And they're careful to say that the red poppies are not supposed to represent blood, even though they are blood red color, but that they're supposed to remember, it's supposed to be an honor and a remembrance of the soldiers who died. But people will also wear white poppies to signify peace, that they are advocates of peace. And they now have purple poppies that people are wearing, and the purple poppies are in commemoration of all of the animals lost and sacrificed during World War I. And they had an image of this poor horse, like suspended on a crane, being hoisted onto a ship to be taken over to Europe, and the horse was like hanging onto it, and so there are purple poppies now that I'm sure PETA and other groups in this country would be very happy to know that the animals are also being remembered and commemorated. But if I may I pivot back to something else that both Jim and Josh brought up about the effect on the colonies. And the growth of this nationalism in many of those colonies, like India, for example. You sort of see the end of this old order, right, that both Jim and Josh referred to. In India, for example, you had these regiments that they volunteered to go, but when you're over there and you're fighting and you're hearing terms towards the end of the war of things like self-determination and democracy, the hypocrite bell starts to ring a little bit, right? Because you know that when you're going home, you're still going to be under British colonial subjugation. So for many of them, it is sort of the beginning, and I'm not necessarily arguing that there would not have been an independence movement in some place like India without World War I, but it certainly helped to speed it up. And it put India in a better position towards the latter years of the war, when Britain needed soldiers for them to be able to say, well, what are you going to give us then? We'd like some self-determination of our own. And the British promised them home rule, which did not happen until after World War II. So there's a bit of a lag time there. But you definitely can make an argument that these wars had an impact on places like South Africa, like India, that began to say to themselves, well, if we're fighting in the name of God and king and country, what about us? So,
to that point, I think it is, really one of, perhaps even one of the most significant elements, that we clearly don't appreciate. I think the figure is something to the tune of 1/6 of all of the soldiers who would have been fighting in the Western Front, with the British and with the French and with eventually the Americans. About 1/6 were from the imperial forces, particularly from India. So we're not necessarily talking about 20,000 individuals and that we need to sort of better remember this. We're talking hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers who were deployed at a time in which the world is, not to say that the world is not highly racialized now, but in a highly racialized time period where they had to sort of alter colonial law to make it acceptable for them to legally take up arms against Europeans. Because this wasn't really fully sanctioned. And the idea was that this was sort of special, that they were sort of being granted the opportunity to, yes, the privilege to necessarily go and to sort of partake in kind of a conflict like this. But we would of course be remiss if we didn't also suggest not only, of course, the issues of politics in a place like Ireland or in a place such as India, but also certainly throughout the Middle East. And the eventual dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, is one of the other elements here of the war. The questions of Palestine and issues of statehood, certainly are brought up as a result of this conflict as well, because the British and the French and others are sort of going back and forth through this area, struggling to take territory as the conflict is going on.
You said that. Do you want me to say something? Okay. You mentioned actually race relations, and so you brought something to mind too. Another major impact that the war has domestically is the migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and that has a tremendous impact on the history of this country. And you also a couple things that were touched upon. So first, we'll start with that. So with the one of the things that we like to say, I think that we sort of pride ourselves on being a little bit smug about in the North is that we're so much better here. We don't have the kind of problems that they have down south. That there aren't lynchings that take place in the North, and I'm always struck anew whenever I hear that by what Martin Luther King said when he came to Chicago in the 1960s, which is that he's like, I've been in some of the worst, most segregated cities in the South, and Chicago's as bad as Birmingham, Alabama. And so during World War I, people were going where the jobs were. And so African Americans were migrating north in search of jobs in factories, so moving to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, et cetera. That's where the work was. And they did not face a very welcome reception when they came up here. And so you saw incidents of race riots taking place in places like East St. Louis, Illinois, Chicago, Illinois, post-World War I, 1919. There's one of the worst race riots ever when a young black boy who's about 9 or 10 years old, has the audacity to swim in the white section of Lake Michigan, and he's stoned to death. And the man who did the stoning was not arrested and was let go. And it set off days and days of race riots in this city. So that's a major legacy that World War I has on this country, is that we see migratory patterns all throughout the world, but particularly in the United States with African American migration to the north.
It's a really good point, I think, to bring up, particularly for Chicago, given, of course, where we are all located. To your point about those race riots, of course, 1919 is a really conflicted year in the course of U.S. history. Not only do you have race riots across many urban areas in the North, but you also have strikes in many communities, many industrial communities, and in some cases, such as the city of Seattle. The city is nearly shut down for a few months as labor activists, seek to take over the government. It was a time in which many individuals sort of wanted, what they thought they had not been denied, of course, during the period of the First World War. One of the stories that has always struck me about the issue of racial rioting in Chicago in 1919 is that black veterans who had returned to their homes on the south side of Chicago eventually had to go into some of the armories and set up patrols and defensive positions on the outskirts of their community in order to protect it because of this heightened environment. Which I think is a really sort of telling statement about sort of the issues of race, and to your point about sort of the sort of mythology that we like to place upon race relations in the North.
And I think actually too, to build on that post-war theme, one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet that's huge for the 20th century and still has repercussions today, if you don't have the First World War, you are not as likely to have the Russian Revolution in 1917.
Absolutely.
And communist Russia and Soviet Union, and then a Cold War that goes on, or a Soviet bloc that emerges after the Second World War based on security concerns from the Soviets that date back to the First World War. I mean, twice in the first half of the 20th century, the Russians had experienced massive invasions of their territory and untold destruction that I think, especially for Americans, is very hard to fathom. I was telling a class this morning that, again, and it's kind of jumping ahead, but, in the Second World War, the Soviets lost something along the lines of 1,900 towns and villages just obliterated, just literally wiped from the face of the earth. How do you, what do you do after that? Well, you decide, look, never again, and you build a really strong set of buffer states outside of your country because that'll slow them down. So I think but you, again, without the First World War, you don't have a Russia that is in slowly teetering on the abyss in many ways, trying to industrialize, trying to modernize from the top down, and in such a way that is not very conducive, but is then forced to fight a modern war against industrialized states that it's completely unprepared for. And also, part of this is the Germans being desperate, find V.I. Lenin suffering through all the woes of his people, all the terrible things that are happening to Russia. The communist leader V.I. Lenin was suffering with them in Zurich, Switzerland. Nice and warm and comfortable, eating, very good chocolate and so forth. But the Germans actually picked him up and transported him in a sealed train into Russia, almost as an act of desperation, like, let's see what will happen if we drop this agitator in. And so you get this communist revolution some months later, which again sets all these other events in motion. And I think that's a huge impact on the 20th century.
Okay. I was struck by your phrase, never again, and I think that that's one of perhaps the other important legacies of the conflict. In the introduction, I know Jim spoke about this being sort of the first industrialized, sort of truly industrialized war. We're not getting into a lot of sort of figures of different things here, but, this is a war that, for the most part, in terms of proportional brutality, Europe hadn't seen since the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. It's a war that saw hundreds of thousands of men, in some cases into the millions, participating in battles. This stands in strong contrast, I think, to what you see in a lot of the 19th century, where Europe is, engaging in a lot of political revolutions, and certainly Napoleon's kind of doing his own thing and also figuring out that Russia is cold in the winter. But, it's relatively peaceful. It's a relatively peaceful century. And so not only do you have this marshaling of arms in a way that the Europeans had never seen and that many other individuals had never seen, but as a result, the brutality of the war is only going to go up in a way, again, that had sort of never been experienced, at least not for multitudes of generations. Now, I'm not trying to connect the technology of the 30 Years' War to the technology of the First World War, but in terms of brutality, this was the closest thing to which Europeans could perhaps draw a moderate connection.
To go back to what Jim said before about Russia, I was immediately had a thought that came into my head that Russian women actually had the right to vote around 1917, but American women still did not during the course of World War I. And I think it's another legacy of the war that's, I think, important to bring up. I don't know if we often, and I think for us, we think that what's happening to us is so immediate and is so real that, it's so important, right? Everything that's happening right now. We don't realize that 100 years ago, it's really a drop in the bucket in the course of history. But 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote. And during World War I, you saw a break occur in the women's suffrage movement, where you had women who were dedicated to a more moderate course, who were looking to petition the government and use sort of a state-by-state campaign for each state to grant women the right to vote, and then eventually it would become federal law. Well, you had another group of women who were fed up with this sort of slow approach and said, we want this to go a little bit faster. We want a federal amendment. We want this passed now, and we're willing to kind of to work towards it. So you saw a break occur in the women's suffrage movement. And when the war breaks out about a year later, these women were already picketing in front of the White House every day. Mr. President, how long must American women wait for liberty? To which Mr. Wilson just ignored them and kind of kept going on about his day. But then World War I breaks out, and women are now faced with a choice. Do they continue their pickets every day, or do they suspend them? And during the Civil War, women put their campaign on hold because they thought, we need to put our efforts towards the war. We need to act as nurses. We need to do what women do during war, which is to basically hold everything together while the men go off and fight. Sorry, guys. And that's what they chose to do that during the Civil War. And then they felt, many of them were upset afterwards when African-American men got the right to vote and women did not. And so during World War I now, the decision was made to continue this war effort, to continue campaigning and picketing in front of the White House every day while American troops were serving overseas. So you can imagine that the impact that had on people seeing these women, these agitators out in front of the White House. Well, they got arrested. They got thrown in jail. They were charged with obstructing traffic, and were sent to basically a prison, to a work prison, a moderate prison. It wasn't like maximum security here. They weren't going to Folsom, but they definitely were in a minimum security facility, where they then proceeded to go on hunger strike while they were in prison to show their dedication to this cause. And finally got to the point where it was embarrassing President Wilson so much, the fact that these women were continuing their campaign in prison. The Washington Post started picking it up, the New York Times started picking it up, and it became embarrassing for President Wilson, who was trying to set himself up as this negotiator for the post-war peace, to now say, well, awkward, women in your country, millions of women in your country cannot vote, but you're advocating democracy for everybody else in the world. So once again, the hypocrite bell is clanging very loudly, and so Wilson's like, well, I guess I need to kind of play ball here. And so suffrage is passed as a war measure. Women fought for the war, and they gave it their all, and so therefore we need to grant them this, while kind of ignoring, and as many history textbooks tend to do, that there was another element to this, that of these more radical women. I know when I was, and I don't know if you guys I'm sure remember this, but in the history textbooks in college, they didn't even mention the Alice Paul or Lucy Burns, the women who were campaigning with the National Women's Party for women to get the right to vote. That kind of story was ignored, and now they've caught up somewhat. They're a little bit better about bringing it up. But that's definitely a legacy for women, is that the war helps speed up the process of suffrage. So, very long story there, but.
At this point, do any of you have any questions or comments that you might like us to address about this, or anything you might like us to expand on? Okay, so if I hear you correctly, you're curious about the Japanese involvement? Yeah, that's another thing that doesn't get discussed a lot, but is very important for especially the future, and it's kind of circuitous. Japan opened in the 1850s by threat of force to Western ideas, very quickly modernizes, and being an island state, they copy a great deal. If you're looking to be a very successful island state in the 1800s, who would you copy off of but Great Britain? And they do that, especially with regards to the Imperial Japanese Navy. And there's a very important moment diplomatically. The Japanese perceived themselves as being sort of the potential overlords of the Pacific. Again, creating their own empire in the Pacific, much the way Great Britain had in much the rest of the world. And it's certainly being co-equal with the European great powers. And in about 1915, the British are strapped for ships, and they actually asked the Japanese to send some of their navy into the Mediterranean. And for the Japanese, it's like 5 destroyers, which is not a big deal. But for the Japanese, it was perceived as this huge thing. Now we are, you see, now we're part of this club. You know, we are equal with the Europeans. And a lot of their, I've seen some of the actual diplomatic telegrams back and forth between London and Tokyo, and there's a very explicit sense of, you know, now we are part of this, you know, we're on your side. But in the post-war environment, that's an illusion, and the Japanese are very quickly disillusioned. In the early 1920s, there's a series of meetings in Washington that lead to this several treaties. It's collectively known as the Washington Naval Accords, and the Japanese felt that they should have the same military strength as the U.S. and Britain in these treaties, but were actually given a second place. Now, from the perspective of London and Washington, you know, we were recognizing Japan's role in World War I. We were recognizing them as a regional power. They should be quite pleased with the sort of pat on the head and you've done well, you know. But for the Japanese, this was considered an insult, and relations between the U.S. and Japan start to get colder after that, and we all know where that eventually leads us.
Oh, wow.
So,
Good question.
yeah, very good question. Anything others or?
Talk a little bit about the global community, League of Nations, and how that conversation extended through the 20th century. So much of that started after World War I.
So,
I think we're still debating on how that community works today or doesn't work today.
oh, it doesn't work. So let's clarify that. You want to talk about how the origins of it, and then.
Why would we care about that? Why does it come from World War I?
Okay. Anybody want me to?
Go for it.
Okay.
Field it.
Okay. Okay. So we. This is it'll take a while. Okay. so anybody? I'm going to throw this question out to you guys. If I were to ask you what the purpose is of the United Nations today? Does anybody know the answer to that question? Yes, sir. Peace, right? And that was the same idea that the League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's baby coming off of World War I. It's the same idea, right? This war was so total in its destruction, so horrifying, that we need to have a mechanism in place so that a war like that never happens ever again. Well, that lasted for about not even 20 years, because part of the problem was the U.S. never actually ended up joining the idea that we had to begin with. And that has to do with American internal politics at home, and Woodrow Wilson offending the Republican Senate. And of course, the Senate needs to ratify a treaty in order for it to become law. And Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge not quite getting along very well, not able to compromise very well. So the U.S. does not end up ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, which includes in it the creation of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations is left essentially weak. And basically kind of limps along through the 1920s and 30s, paying lip service to peace, but there's not really any some force behind it, some teeth behind it. So when World War II then begins, 20 years later, the need for and the desire for a more strengthened League of Nations comes about, because obviously, again, we can't keep having every 20 years a war like this. We're not going to be left with anybody on the planet if we keep going like this. And so by 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, along with his wife Eleanor, who was a great proponent, particularly of human rights, we see the creation of the United Nations in April of '45, and now it's much more strengthened. Right, we've got the U.S. is now fully committed, fully involved, along with its other partners. Who, if you look at the names of the people that have power in the United Nations, it's kind of interesting. It's the U.S., it's the U.K., which makes sense. It's France, which sort of makes sense if you know France, and you've got the Soviets, right, the Russians, and you've got the Chinese. Well, at that point, we're BFFs with the Russians, and we're still BFFs with the Chinese before the Chinese become communist, and before we're no longer friendly with the Russians anymore. So the good thing about it, I guess, that you could say is that post-World War II, the UN is much more strengthened. In terms of how well it works today, that's a whole other story, because you're talking about people that have the competing national interests trying to come to agreements on issues of world peace, on issues of sanctions, on issues of war, human rights, and they're never quite able to necessarily come to agreement and all have the ability to veto one another on that. So what we oftentimes see happening is that, for example, the Iraq War, when the United States in 2003 in 2002 tried making the case before the United Nations, you had member states of the permanent member states of the UN Security Council who were not on board. So then the U.S. ended up acting unilaterally because it could not get UN cooperation. Same thing happened in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s when the UN Security Council could not act. NATO ends up stepping in and acting in a different capacity. So did I sort of answer your question, or if my colleagues want to jump in on that one too? Anything you want to?
I think I'd add a few things about the early period that also keep in mind that as problematic as the UN Security Council can be, I think even though they weren't exactly thinking this way at the time, some of the key players, it still makes sense. I mean, you do have essentially the great powers. France, yeah, we can
joke about them.
That's what mostly we do, right? Is joke about France. But the U.S., the U.K., China, and Russia are still very significant international players, and will likely remain so for the foreseeable future. So, having them at the helm, having them represented, is certainly much better than the early years when, the Versailles Treaty, which I mentioned to a class today, is probably, if you're looking for an example of how not to write a peace treaty, that's, one of the key belligerents is not even allowed in, right? The Germans don't have any say at Versailles. They're basically told, sign this or else, when the treaty's written. Right? And Russia is not involved because they're communist and they're a pariah state for a while. Like, no one's talking to them. So you're excluding two very significant players in Europe and globally, certainly, just whether or not they decided to rearm in the 1930s. Certainly Germany, when it got the economic sort of boon of the sanctions off their backs, would have been Germany was a major economic player in Europe going into World War I without the reparations, which in ways were designed to cow their economy for a time. They would have been a major economic player as well. So, excluding major powers from any negotiations, any say in how the world is going to go is really kind of a short-sighted approach. It gets a little bit better. There are attempts to fix the League of Nations. Locarno in the mid-1920s when Germany, Britain, and France agree to a fresh diplomatic start. But by the same token, there's a sort of dream state that I think takes place with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Like, we pledge not to use war as a means to solve our international disputes. Okay, but what if, unless you get every nation in the world to sign on, you'll have that one guy who doesn't agree, and what do you do with him?
Daisies.
Yeah. Just go over there, wait in the corner. Right? But again, I think there is that, there's one British historian who's made the argument that many of the leaders in Europe, actually two things. Many of the leaders in Europe in the interwar period were kind of the second string because the best and brightest of that generation, who would be the rising leaders in Europe, had died. If you were going to be a leader, what did you do? Well, you volunteered and you led your unit on the Western Front. And if you were really a good leader, you said, "Come follow me." So you were the first one out into the machine gun fire. So you had the second string leaders kind of calling the shots, who certainly weren't maybe the best decision makers, but bought very deeply into this idea of war to end all wars, and believed that if we just outlaw it, if we just make a law that says, well, we're not going to use war anymore, then everyone will obey the law because it's the law. Right. So,
which I think certainly does lead us into a discussion of the rise of the political conflicts of the 1930s and the eventual sort of beginning of the Second World War. You have this view on the part particularly of British diplomats throughout the end of the 1920s and the early 1930s that, well, reasonable men can sit down and work out their differences. We don't need to have, some type of conflict. Of course, this is later referred to as appeasement. Once we get into this idea of an expansionist Germany, run by, fascist National Socialists and Adolf Hitler and his Nazis. So, I think it certainly does see a transition from one to the other. I've heard this in some ways discussed as we should perhaps even rethink how we conceive, in terms of periods of the First World War and the Second World War, almost in many ways as sort of the same conflict, sort of continuing on, whereas sort of the interwar period may be a less sort of overtly violent period, more sort of a political negotiating period. I don't know. So.
And piggybacking off of that, in the 1930s, when we get to the Munich conference in 1938, when, whenever we're talking about it in class, sometimes a student may ask, and this is when European leaders essentially are appeasing Adolf Hitler by, okay, you just want to take that little part of Czechoslovakia, go ahead, we'll let you alone. You're not going to take anything else. We know you're not going to go anywhere else. We'll kind of go along with it. And I think it's understandable at that point, because we're talking about less than 20 years ago, you had millions of people being killed in this war, and they wanted to do everything they possibly could to avoid another conflict. And so when people, even during the Cold War, talk about appeasement, and you've got to put it in its historical context. It's not fair to really criticize them. It's quite understandable to know where they're coming from. Nobody ever wanted this to continue. In World War I and World War II, I mean, it's just a 20-year armistice in between. It is essentially the same war, but by the time you get to World War II, you've got even better weapons. But so I definitely think that it's important to put it in its context and to not necessarily come down too hard on these guys, because it's understandable to know where they're coming from.
And to piggyback off of that, to piggyback off the piggyback, you also have the idea that, I think today we've gotten into this habit of, and especially in the lead up to the Iraq War in 2003, of anything short of commitment is appeasement. And I think the word has been misunderstood and misapplied. There are also very pragmatic reasons. Germany and France really did not maintain their militaries because their economies were crippled by the war. You have the two countries in the world that are extending credit all over the globe, and 4 years later, they're in debt to someone else. They don't have, and one of the reasons they certainly were very proactive about the Washington Naval Conference was, well, this means, if we limit construction, we don't need to build anymore. We don't need to spend on our, and so they had not rearmed. And when they saw Germany as a threat, they saw the rise of Nazism as a threat. But that's great. What do you do about it when you have no way to defend yourself? And I mean, it's cold-hearted, but you see it in international politics quite often, where certainly the French are going to be more than willing to sell Czechoslovakia down the road to save France, or to buy time for their own preparations. And I think, but I think that appeasement is much more complex than is often put out there, and I think it's also misapplied in our current context to things, because it's a very, very different situation that these European states find themselves in, and there really isn't anyone who is capable of standing up against an aggressive Germany in 1937 or 38. They are not prepared. They don't have a military that's capable of doing it. So if you can't fight, what do? Well, you bargain. That's your only option. So.
Right. Another legacy, I think, of World War II, or World War I, excuse me, that I think is needs to be brought up is the legacy on the negative impact on civil liberties. And it's something that I usually try to draw out of a class, and I'm going to ask all of you here too what you think about this, and whether or not it's okay to roll back civil liberties during time of war. And just to kind of give you a little bit of context, the U.S. government passed in 1917, the Congress passed in 1917, the Espionage and later on the Sedition Act, which basically made it a crime to utter any sort of criticism of the U.S. government, to criticize the draft or to protest against the draft, or of course sedition, to utter any kind of negative comment against the Constitution or the government. And you saw people being imprisoned for that. One man who resisted the draft, who was encouraging people to resist the draft, ends up going to prison, makes his case, appeals his case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically says, no, sorry, we're going to uphold your conviction and you're going to go to jail for this. The Sedition Act was allowed to expire, but the Espionage Act still remains on the books today. and still can be invoked. And so when Edward Snowden was releasing all these documents to WikiLeaks, classified government documents, you know, if the U.S. government ever gets a hold of him, it's probably safe to say that he might be held under the Espionage Act. And so I guess the question that I think that is important for you folks to be talking about and thinking about is whether or not it's okay to infringe upon people's civil liberties during a time of war. And is that ever okay? Or are you risking democracy even more when you do it? Is it more important, even more during a time of war, to uphold people's right to free speech, to be able to criticize the war or be able to criticize whatever they want to criticize, the president or whomever it may be? What are your thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
Well, I'm a little bit biased because I actually am an artist myself. So I feel it's absolutely not right at all to suppress any sort of speech for, against, and especially if it's against the war. What's going to stop the war? It's the people. And if the people can't speak out against this war, be it the draft or the war itself, then crap.
So not a good thing. So you're very much an advocate of civil liberties being maintained during time of war.
I'm an advocate of civil liberties being maintained all the time.
All the time. Thank you. Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
I was going to try and diverge a little bit. Gallipoli versus D-Day. You guys remember that battle?
Gallipoli?
Yeah.
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 Big with Turkey.
D-Day worked. Gallipoli didn't.
What kind of influence did it have on the actual planning of D-Day?
Oh, okay. So what was the influence of Gallipoli, if any, on the planning of D-Day? Actually, yeah, I have seen some stuff on that. The British were more reticent to try Gallipoli is something that is very much lost in much of the history of World War I. Although there is an old Mel Gibson movie on it, and it's so old Mel still had an Australian accent. So for anyone who's looking for something to do, right? But the straits, the Bosporus that connect the Aegean with the Black Sea, the idea was for the British to get supplies to the Russians, so they were going to send ships through these straits, which were controlled by the Ottoman Empire, who was against the British and the Russians in the First World War. So the British, Winston Churchill, this is what I had alluded to earlier, was head of the Royal Navy. He's what was called the First Lord of Admiralty. And he came up with this idea of initially trying to run ships through these straits at full speed, at which point they found that the Ottomans had mined the straits. So they sent in these Australian, New Zealand, Canadian troops to try and much of this is very small beaches with lots of cliffs very close to the shore, not much room. And they tried to go up and over these cliffs. It was a complete disaster. It cost thousands of men their lives. The British eventually pulled up stakes and left. Churchill lost his job as First Lord of the Admiralty. So it was, and I think and Winston Churchill goes on. He has his time in the wilderness, as he calls it, where he's kind of out of politics. And eventually comes back as British Prime Minister during the Second World War. And you can imagine, with that in his background, when we start talking about a cross-channel invasion, he's a little bit reticent about that. But as time goes on, clearly Churchill, I mean, there is some restraint. He's not jumping up and down at the idea. But the other thing to keep in mind, actually several, that Churchill was certainly aware of, there's Torch, which is the U.S.-led invasion of North Africa to liberate that. There's also the landings in Italy. We've done this successfully by the time we're talking about D-Day. We're also doing quite well with the island hopping in the Pacific. We've kind of figured out a lot of the how to do amphibious warfare, and we have so much. The other part of it, too, that Churchill was clearly aware of and shows up in much of his diary writings is that he is clearly aware of how much material weight the U.S. is contributing. And it's not a good idea to upset your sugar daddy, to put it bluntly. And so he does kind of go, he very much realizes that, like, we have to go along with this because the Americans want it to happen, and they're providing our material and our food. Actually, we're feeding Great Britain during the Second World War as well.
I think to return to a certain extent to something that Mary was bringing up earlier, I think it's important not only to sort of debate the merits of this issue of to what extent are questions of civil liberty, very central in time of war. I think one of the legacies of the First World War that we also should keep in mind is really the pervasive anti-Germanism that existed throughout the period, quite profoundly so. Strong connections are made in the minds of the public that if someone is of German descent, if someone is of German origin, regardless of their station in life, or whether they are a recently arrived immigrant or someone who was born and raised in this country, that by virtue of that descent, by virtue of that connection, that they are somehow not American or in some ways a threat and must be treated as such. Now, this had any number of sort of applications in the daily lives of individuals, from amusing things, such as generally Americans stopped calling sauerkraut sauerkraut and they started calling it Liberty cabbage, because, that'll win the war.
That'll get them.
Right, yes, that will show them. You see, I think it was the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra literally arrested for attempting to conduct music that was written by a German composer. You have, people assaulted on the streets. You have, in fact, the murder in Collinsville, Illinois, of a man by the name of Robert Prager, whose only crime was that he was, in fact, German, or of German descent. So I think that, it's important to keep that sort of legacy sort of in mind when it comes to some of these questions of, how far we can take certain things. I think most of us, might focus perhaps on the internment of Japanese Americans sort of during the Second World War, and that might be perhaps the defining legacy on some of these issues of treatment of individuals during time of war, although the more recent conflicts, certainly elements of, sort of Arabism, anti-Muslim sort of strains, have occurred. But I think it's important then to perhaps keep that in that sort of longer legacy and that sort of perspective. So I don't see it necessarily just an issue of civil liberty, in that particular political case, but an issue sort of there as well. We had, to that in this country during the war, two voluntary organizations that had connections to the United States government. One was something called the American Protective League, and another one was called the Committee of Public Information. Now, the American Protective League had badges. They had badges. There's about 250,000 people, and they would stage things like slacker raids. So they would go around, because there was a draft in this country at that time, and accost young men who they thought should be in the military, and forcibly take them down to the draft office and make sure that they were duly, sort of registered for the military. So, going to families' homes armed, saying, what have you done to buy enough war bonds to support, the country? There are questions of this sort of tipping over into something else. So I think it's an important discussion necessarily to have about sort of this idea of individuals appropriate elements of patriotism in a very personal way, and so one could argue that there is sort of a spectrum that exists when it comes to those experiences. So I think it's important for us to at least in some ways keep that legacy, because by the census of 1920, you see less people identifying themselves as being of German origin in this country versus the census of 1910, and an exodus had not occurred in terms of that amount of individuals from the country. It was folks were just sort of not declaring that anymore.
Josh, you brought up some excellent points. One of them about I'm glad that you brought up the issue of Wagner and Beethoven and Liberty sandwiches, and because we saw a little bit of the stupidity of that. Excuse me for putting it so bluntly, in the run up to the Iraq War with the freedom fries, because France was the country in the Security Council that was very much against the Iraq War. So we did see a little bit of that. We saw post 9/11, a gentleman who had the crime of being a Sikh, who was not even a Muslim and was not even Arabic, but who was actually murdered in Arizona post 9/11 in the aftermath, and national sentiment was so stirred up. But I think one of the differences I think is of the legacy is what has not happened, which is that immediately that kind of sentiment was quelled in this country, whereas in World War I it was almost fostered, it was almost developed. And one of the other differences, I think, very stark differences, is how tied people were, how many stakes people actually had in World War I. That people, Josh mentioned the buying of war bonds. We funded World War I and World War II in part through the sale of war bonds. And so you're whatever. I mean, I'm making that $5 now, and then later on you're gonna get maybe your investment of $10 back. Let's say if you put some money into the government right now. And one of the things I think that's a stark contrast to our more recent wars is how little people are asked to sacrifice. People were asked to sacrifice tremendously during World War I and World War II. Having your Liberty Garden, growing your own vegetables so that you wouldn't be taking food away from the troops who needed it. Prohibition is put into effect by saying that, that we need that grain for the troops. You can't use it towards your beer, which is, a crime in and of itself, but that's another story. But now, in recent years, for our recent wars, what sacrifices are we really asked to make, unless you are a serviceman or it's your family or you're directly impacted by that? For the most part, we're just going about our daily lives, and none of us are really impacted by it. Whereas in World War I, every day people were living it. When they were sacrificing their shoes for their rubber for the war, their tires, more in World War II, but and in World War I, being asked to grow your own food, and so that you're not, again, taking away meat or things that needed to go for the soldiers. So there's a definite stark difference in how I think that we approach these conflicts. We're not asked to really sacrifice much. Yes, sir, you have a question?
Yes, I was going to ask this, with how you brought up how it's completely different now. We repeat our history, but differently now. Do you all have hope for the future, for this country, for the world, for peace?
So the question is, because the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn anything from history. So therefore, you're asking basically, can World War I happen again, or is that?
I'm asking, I'm sure you see even more glaringly how we've repeated ourselves as a country as a world with atrocities and other things. Do you feel that? Do you have hope for the future?
Go ahead.
I think as an historian, it's a tough question to answer, because the nature of the discipline, as I've heard it described, is the study of man's inhumanity to man. So we spend much of our time sort of being Debbie Downers, very negative about different things. Spend 5 minutes with us and we'll ruin every Disney movie you've ever seen, whether you want us to or not. But I think it depends, which as well is another fairly common historian's answer. I can say that the power of the individual has grown exponentially, over the course of the last 100 years, and certainly over the course of the last 30, with all of the new sort of technologies and access to them that we have. Elements of history, themes of it certainly repeat themselves, but there are innovations that one could say do give us hope. If we were to take this back to a study of hundreds of years prior to the First World War, we'd look at things like life expectancies, where those are quite different. Perhaps today than certainly during those periods. One of the things that we haven't sort of discussed in terms of a legacy in this panel yet, for example, would be the influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu, which didn't come from Spain, that occurred, spoilers, right after and at the sort of tail end of the First World War, which, and again, taking figures somewhat with a grain of salt in that it varies widely by whoever you read, but this is a global pandemic that occurs between 1918 and 1919 and conservatively kills at least 25 million people, if not more. Probably more individuals than the Black Death in the 14th century. Are we better prepared and better cognizant of our ability to project force to try to combat things like this? Well, yeah, you could make an argument that we have a better capability to do that. So, can we see hope in that? Sure. But are things still comparatively bad for some folks? Sure.
I had to throw my little Debbie Downer sound effect for him because he had to bring in the Spanish influenza. Wah, wah, everyone's dead. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit more Pollyanna-esque on this one. And I think that one of the differences post-World War I and post-World War II is that our economies are so much more intertwined now than they ever were before. And there's actually a theory out there that every country that has a McDonald's has not gone to war with one another since they both have their McDonald's. That, in other words, globalization kind of brings us together, right? When we yeah, and there's some, I think there's some legitimacy to that, though. I mean, it's not going to be in your best interest to go to war with another nation if your economic interests are tied to that nation. So it's less likely that the U.S. and China are going to go to war with one another. First of all, they're not going to go to war with one another conventionally because they already are going to war with one another in cyberspace. That's already taking place right now. How many times that the Chinese are trying to hack into our databases and vice versa. So that the whole face of that has changed dramatically. But I do, maybe I'm a little bit more, a little too optimistic here, but I do like to think that the more closely interconnected we are with one another, the less likely we are to see a conflict on this particular scale. So watch, I'll make a liar out of myself in a couple years, but hopefully not. Hopefully this tape will have been destroyed by then. So,
yeah, I think piggybacking on that is the idea that there's also a great deal more diversity. I mean, it was very easy for these governments to create an other out of an opponent. They're different from us, and especially because if you're getting your average German peasant or American farm boy or whatever, he's probably, he's never been to Europe. He has no idea. And you're quite honestly, in 1914, your average German peasant really hadn't seen a Frenchman. They didn't travel that much. And today, I mean, if you look around this room, this is a very good solution because, it's very easy to turn to the person next to you and go, well, hold it, Fox News just told me you're all like this. And they, no, we're not. I don't agree with that, So it's much harder, point being, it's much harder for any media outlet, whatever it be, ABC, Fox, whatever, TMZ, where I get all my news, right? But that's the French and TMZ are actually what we joke about most in the history department. So the truth is out. But I think you get the idea that when you have a diverse environment, when you have a globalized world, it's not only are you trading with one another, not only is it not in your nation's best interest, but you interact with people, and it's really hard to demonize the foe when you go, well, hold it, I'm working next to this guy, and he's of whatever group, right? Fill in the blank, and he's not like that. We actually get along pretty well, and if there's anyone we don't like, well, it's the boss, and that has nothing to do with race or creed. It's but you get the idea. I think we can get find a lot more likenesses rather than differences, and I think too that in certain ways, a lot of this idea of great power kind of conflict, like you had mentioned the America-Chinese example. I could be making a liar of myself now, but for the foreseeable future, that is much less likely. I mean, it's not only are we at war with China in cyberspace, but we actually encourage them to try and hack our sites, and they encourage us to hack theirs. Why? So that we can make sure our security systems are up to date. So it almost becomes, you know, and I think the part that, you know, I guess for the downer, right, for the Debbie Downer part, the part that becomes almost frightening is it then almost becomes war games, right? Then it almost becomes, well, we're just playing at this until someone crosses the line, right? Whatever line in cyberspace that may be. But I think the other part of it that is kind of more disturbing is that you also, it was mentioned individualization, you also have these small splinter groups that can get their hands on unparalleled levels of technology for good or ill. You know, there is another side to that coin where we can communicate with one another much more easily than any humans ever have in our entire history. But we can also, you know, spread viruses, both in cyberspace and real viruses, more readily than we've ever been able to. So I think, you know, I guess there may not be a rosy portrait, but there is hope, and there is the possibility that equipped with some understanding of these things, and, you know, mistakes that we can learn from the mistakes people have made, and we will probably make new ones, but that's the nature of humanity. You know, but at least if we're making new,
That was
I think
well
we should
done.
stop
Well
there.
played,
Yeah,
sir.
this is the Costanza, right? We're out. But thank you. Any additional questions or comments?
That was a nice ending question for us, sir. Thank you very
Yes,
much.
Thank you. Thank you.
How about a round of applause?
Thank you.